She arrived at 6:45 on a Saturday morning in late August of 2019, when the grounds crew was still dragging the clay at the Illinois State Truck and Tractor Pull in Kankakee County, and she backed the 1972 Mack R685 into its staging position in Lane 3, without a spotter. Most people did not notice. The ones who did noticed quietly. Her name was Deanna Kowalczyk. She was 37 years old. She had driven the truck 41 miles that morning from her property outside of Buckingham, down Route 102, alone in the cab with a thermos of coffee and the particular kind of quiet a person settles into when they have decided something and are on their way to prove it. By the time the crowd filled the grandstands, and the crowd did fill them, 4,000 strong by the time the first class ran, most of those people had already made up their minds about the woman standing next to the rust-dusted Mack in Lane 3. The truck was not helping her case. The hood was the original burnt orange, faded to something closer to old brick. The chrome on the bulldog hood ornament had gone to a dull pewter that caught the afternoon light without reflecting it. 2 vertical exhaust stacks rose black behind the cab like fingers raised in patience. The tires were not new. The frame rails carried the kind of surface rust that accumulates over decades of honest work, not neglect, but the crowd did not know the difference between those two things, and most of them were not trying to find out. She stood next to the truck in work jeans and a gray canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, dark hair pulled back under a faded green cap with nothing on it. No sponsor, no logo, no team name. She was checking the left front lug nuts with a torque wrench she had owned since 2004, going around the wheel in the star pattern her father had taught her, and she was not looking at anyone. In Lane 1, there was a Kenworth W900 that had been built specifically for state-level competition. It belonged to a pulling team out of Joliet called Midwest Apex Performance, and it was wrapped in a black and orange vinyl that covered every surface from bumper to cab corner. The team had a matching enclosed trailer, a generator, a canopy with folding chairs, and 4 crew members in matching black polos. The Kenworth's engine was a purpose-built competition diesel that had been dyno-tested at 1,140 horsepower. The team's crew chief, a man named Garrett Foss, had been pulling at the state level for 9 years. He had a headset around his neck and a clipboard in his left hand. And when he walked past Lane 3 during the morning staging, he slowed for just a moment, looked at the Mack the way a surgeon looks at something that should not be on the operating table, and then kept walking. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The entry fee for the modified diesel class was $250. Deanna had paid it in cash from a folded envelope she kept in her front pocket. The Kenworth team had paid the same fee, which was, in the way of such things, both the most equal and the most unequal fact of the entire morning. Now, I need to stop here and tell you about Deanna Kowalczyk, because without knowing who she is and where she came from, the rest of this story is just a truck pull. Her grandfather, Tadeusz Kowalczyk, had emigrated from Krakow to Kankakee County in 1951 with $40, a trade certificate in diesel mechanics from a school that no longer exists, and a disposition toward silence that his family came to understand was not coldness, but concentration. He had worked for a Mack dealer in Bourbonnais for 11 years before buying his own service shop on a gravel road outside of Buckingham in 1962. A 2-bay building with a concrete floor that he poured himself over 3 weekends in September. He had bought the property outright, 7.5 acres, and he had never refinanced it. He drove a series of used trucks that he maintained with the precision of a man who understood that mechanical reliability was not a luxury, but a form of self-respect. He had kept notebooks, spiral-bound, one per year, in which he recorded every repair, every measurement, every deviation from specification he encountered in the engines that came through his bays. By the time he retired in 1994, there were 32 notebooks on a shelf above his workbench, and he knew where every one of them was. Deanna's father, Marek, had grown up in that shop. He had learned to read torque specs before he learned to read a novel, and he had spent his adult life driving long-haul freight for an independent carrier out of Montano, putting in the kind of hours that did not leave much time for anything else. He was a quiet man who expressed affection through mechanical instruction, and Deanna had understood this early. She had understood that when her father showed her how to adjust valve lash on a diesel engine on a Saturday morning when she was 11 years old, that was his version of a long conversation. She had paid attention accordingly. The 1972 Mack R685 had been her grandfather's work truck. Tadues had bought it used in 1978, when it was already 6 years old, and he had used it for hauling equipment and materials to job sites and occasionally for pulling stumps out of the back 40 on the property. He had maintained it with the same precision he applied to every piece of equipment he owned, and when he passed away in February of 2016, the truck was in the shop, half disassembled, in the middle of what had been a top-end rebuild he had started the previous November. He had been 81 years old, and he had been rebuilding an engine because he believed it still had useful life in it, which told you most of what you needed to know about the man. Deanna had finished the rebuild. It had taken her 14 months, working evenings and weekends, because she was also working a full-time position at a parts counter in Montano and raising her daughter, who was 9 at the time, largely on her own. Her ex-husband had not been interested in the truck. Her brother had suggested selling it. Her mother had worried quietly and brought food to the shop on Sunday afternoons and did not say anything about the hours. Deanna had used her grandfather's notebooks, all 32 of them, and she had found the one from 1978 that contained his notes from when he first acquired the truck, the measurements he had taken, the deviations he had corrected, the specifications he had brought everything back to. She had used those notes as a baseline. She had then spent the next 14 months improving on them. Here is what she built, and I need you to stay with me for a few minutes because this is the part that explains everything that happened at 3:47 in the afternoon on that Saturday in August. The R685 came from the factory with what Mack called the END T673 engine. It was a 6-cylinder turbocharged diesel displacing 673 cubic inches, which is just over 11 liters for those of you keeping track, and it was built in an era when Mack was still manufacturing its own engines entirely in-house, which meant the metallurgy, the tolerances, the design philosophy, all of it came from one source with one set of priorities. Those priorities were not horsepower. They were torque, durability, and reliability under sustained load, because the trucks this engine went into were working trucks, not racing trucks, and the men who designed it understood that a truck that could pull a full trailer up a grade all day long without drama was worth more than a truck that could win a sprint and need a rebuild. The END T673 in stock form produced somewhere between 237 and 285 horsepower, depending on the year and configuration, which sounds modest. What it also produced, and this is the number that matters, was 1,050 foot-pounds of torque at 1,200 revolutions per minute. That number was not a peak figure that the engine touched briefly on its way through the power band. That was the number the engine lived at, the number it was designed to sustain, the number it would hold under load while lesser engines were already climbing toward their rev limiter, looking for something they had already passed. Now, I need you to understand something about how a truck pull works, because this is the intellectual key to everything that happened on that strip. A truck pull uses what is called a progressive weight transfer sled. The sled starts with its weight distributed toward the rear, and as the truck pulls it forward, a mechanical system transfers that weight progressively toward the front of the sled, which means the resistance the truck is fighting increases with every foot it travels. The first 100 feet are manageable for almost any competitive rig. The next 100 feet separate the capable from the committed, and beyond 200 feet, what you are asking of an engine is not peak performance, but sustained performance under increasing resistance, and that is a completely different question than the one most modern high-horsepower builds are designed to answer. Peak horsepower is a number that lives at the top of the RPM range. It is what an engine can do at its most excited, its most stressed, its most temporary condition. It is the sprint. Torque, and specifically torque at low RPM, is what an engine can do when it is asked to work, not race. It is the draft horse leaning into the collar. It is the force that does not announce itself, but cannot be stopped. The Kenworth in Lane 1 was producing 1,140 horsepower. That is a spectacular number. It is the kind of number that sounds like winning before the pull starts. What Garrett Foss's team had built was a machine designed to produce maximum power at high RPM, which meant it needed to be moving, needed to be spinning, needed the sled resistance to stay within a range where the engine could stay in its power band. When the sled got heavy, when the resistance climbed past the point where the engine could maintain its RPM, that power would begin to fall away, because the power only existed up high, and up high was exactly where a loaded sled would not let it stay. Deanna had not modified the ENDT 673 for horsepower. She had modified it for torque at the bottom. She had rebuilt the top end with her grandfather's specifications as a floor, not a ceiling. She had reworked the injection timing, not to chase peak power, but to broaden the torque curve, to push that 1,050 foot-pound figure lower in the RPM range and hold it there longer. She had gone through the turbocharger, rebalanced it, matched the compressor housing to the engine's actual airflow characteristics, rather than what the factory had specified for a truck that would spend its life at highway speeds. She had blueprinted the bottom end to tolerances that her grandfather's notebook suggested were achievable, but that the factory had not bothered with at production volume. The result was an engine that produced peak torque at somewhere around 900 revolutions per minute, which is almost an idle, and held it in a band that extended through 1,400 revolutions per minute without significant drop-off. It was not a fast engine. It was a patient one. It was an engine that would not be hurried and could not be stopped. She had also done something with the transmission that the people in Lane 1 had not thought about, because the people in Lane 1 were thinking about horsepower. The R685 ran a Mack Maxitorque 10-speed with a compound low-gear ratio that, in the right selection, multiplied the engine's torque output through the drivetrain to the point where the force arriving at the rear axles was a number that made the sled's progressive resistance feel like a suggestion rather than a wall. She had gone through that transmission the same way she had gone through the engine. Every bearing, every synchronizer, every gear mesh clearance. Her grandfather's notebook from 1983 had a section on the Maxitorque that read like a graduate thesis, and she had read it enough times that she could recite passages from memory. Total cost of the rebuild, including parts, machine work at a shop in Bourbonnais, and the replacement components she could not source used, $8,400. The Kenworth in Lane 1 had cost, by the estimate of people who knew that market, somewhere between $380,000 and $420,000 to build and campaign to state level. By late morning, the crowd had settled into the grandstands, and the smell of the midway, fried dough and diesel exhaust and cut grass drying in the August heat, had layered itself into the air above the clay strip. The temperature was 86 degrees at noon and climbing, which mattered because heat thins the air, and thin air means less oxygen in every intake stroke, which means less combustion energy available, which affects high RPM power more severely than low RPM torque. Deanna had noted the temperature when she arrived and had made one adjustment to her fuel delivery that morning, a small one, the kind of adjustment that takes 3 minutes if you know exactly what you're doing and an hour if you are guessing. The modified diesel class ran in the early afternoon. There were 11 trucks entered. The Kenworth went in the 4th position. Garrett Foss's crew had the engine running 20 minutes before the pull, warming it through, and the sound it made was the sound of serious money. A deep, tuned, purposeful note that carried across the grounds and turned heads in the midway. When it staged and hooked to the sled, the crowd leaned forward. It launched hard, the rear tires pressing into the clay with authority, the exhaust stacks throwing black smoke in the first seconds of maximum effort, and it moved through the first 100 feet the way a well-built competition rig moves, with controlled aggression, everything working together, the kind of mechanical confidence that comes from 9 years of refinement and a budget that could absorb mistakes. At 150 feet, the Kenworth was still moving well. At 200 feet, the sled was getting heavy and the engine note had begun to climb, which was the engine searching for RPM it needed to stay in its power band. At 240 feet, the tires began to break traction intermittently, the rear end hunting slightly side to side as the engine pushed against a sled that was no longer cooperating with the power band it had been built for. At 271 feet, the truck stopped. The sled had won. 271 feet. The crowd gave Garrett Foss's team what it deserved, which was genuine appreciation for a serious pull by a serious machine. The number went up on the board. 271 feet was the mark. That was what the afternoon had to beat. Deanna's turn came 7th. She had been sitting on the running board of the Mack during the earlier pulls, drinking water from a steel thermos, watching each truck make its run with the focused patience of someone who is not nervous but is paying very close attention to information. When the class official called her number, she capped the thermos, set it on the seat through the open window, and walked to the front of the truck. She put her hand flat on the hood, just above the grill for a moment. Not a gesture for the crowd. The crowd was not watching yet. It was the gesture of a person checking in with something they know well. She climbed into the cab. The Mack started on the first turn of the key, which it always did, and the sound it made was not the sound of the Kenworth. It was lower, rougher, more fundamental, the sound of an engine that had been running for 51 years and had no intention of stopping. The exhaust stacks sent 2 thin lines of dark smoke into the August air and then cleared as the engine settled into its idle, which was a sound like a very large, very calm animal breathing. There was laughter in the grandstands. Not universal, not cruel, but present. the sound of people who had already decided what they were watching. A few people near the rail were taking pictures, the kind of pictures you take of something you find amusing rather than something you find impressive. Someone in the upper section said something that got a laugh from the people around him. Deanna, inside the cab, did not hear any of it, or if she did, she gave no sign. She staged the truck. The hookup crew attached the chain to the hitch, and when the chain went tight, the sound it made was a single sharp metallic note that cut through the ambient noise of the grounds. A clean, hard sound, the sound of slack becoming force, the sound of the question being asked. She selected her gear. Not the gear a driver selects when they want to launch hard and build speed. The gear a driver selects when they want to apply maximum torque from the first inch of movement and hold it through every foot that follows. The truck moved. That is the only way to describe it that does it justice. It moved. Not launched, not surged, not charged. It moved the way a glacier moves, the way a river moves against a dam, the way something with enormous patience and no doubt about the outcome moves when it has decided to go. The tires did not spin. They pressed into the Kankakee clay and found it and kept it, and the clay curled up at the edges of the tire contact patch the way soil curls up behind a plow blade, which is the oldest form of that force in the world. The exhaust note did not climb. It deepened. The engine was not searching for RPM. It was already where it needed to be, down in that low band, that 900 to 1,100 revolutions per minute range, where the torque curve was flat and enormous and patient, and it was going to stay there. At 50 feet, the grandstands had gone quiet in the way grandstands go quiet when something is happening that people do not yet have the framework to understand. At 100 feet, the Mack was still moving at the same pace it had started, not faster, not slower. The same deliberate, unbroken forward motion, the engine note unchanged, the tires unchanged, the truck behaving as though the sled behind it was a minor consideration rather than a progressive mechanical force designed to stop it. At 150 feet, a man in the third row of the grandstands who had not stood up for any of the previous pulls stood up. At 200 feet, the sled was at the weight that had begun to slow the Kenworth, the weight that had started the RPM hunt that eventually ended Garrett Foss's pull at 271 feet. The Mack's engine note did not change. There was no RPM hunt because there was no need to find RPM that was already there. The torque curve was still flat. The engine was still in the middle of its working range. It had not yet been asked to do anything it was not designed to sustain indefinitely. The grandstands were standing. At 250 feet, the Mack passed the distance that had stopped 7 of the 11 trucks entered in the class. At 271 feet, the Mack passed the mark that Garrett Foss's Kenworth had set. The crowd's sound at that moment was not a cheer. It was something more involuntary than a cheer. A collective exhale and intake, a sound the body makes before the mind has finished processing what the eyes have seen. The man in the third row, who had stood at 150 feet, put both hands on the rail in front of him and said nothing. The Mack kept moving. At 290 feet, the engine note had finally begun to deepen further, the load becoming something that even this engine was working against, the torque curve beginning to meet the resistance at the edge of its flat region. But the tires were still finding the clay. The truck was still moving. It was slower now, measurably slower, the pace of something enormous working at the outer edge of its capacity, but working, not failing. There is a difference between those two things, and anyone who has ever watched a draft horse lean into a collar at the far end of its strength knows exactly what that difference looks like. At 311 feet, the Mack stopped. 311 feet. The chain went slack. The engine settled back to its idle, that low breathing sound, and the exhaust stacks sent two thin lines of smoke into the August sky above Kankakee County. The grandstands were making a sound that had nothing to do with amusement anymore. Deanna sat in the cab for a moment, not performing stillness, actually still, the way a person is still when they are listening to something finish. Then she opened the door and climbed down, and she walked to the rear of the truck and looked at the tires, checking the wear pattern on the contact patch the way she always did, the way her grandfather had taught her to do, because the tires will tell you things about what happened during a pull that the gauges will not. She crouched down and looked at the left rear, then the right rear, then stood up and nodded at something that only she had asked. Garrett Foss walked over. He had his headset around his neck and his clipboard was gone, which meant he had put it down somewhere, which meant he had come over without his professional equipment, which was its own kind of statement. He stood next to her at the rear of the Mack and looked at the truck for a moment. "What are you running?" he said. "ENDT 673, Deanna said. "Original block." He looked at the truck for another moment. "Timing?" he said. "Modified," she said. He nodded. He put his hand on the frame rail of the Mack, not quite a gesture of respect, not quite unconscious. Somewhere between the two. "Good pull," he said. "Thank you," she said. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Her daughter, Marta, who was 12 years old in August of 2019, had come to the pull with Deanna's mother. They had been sitting in the 8th row of the grandstands, which Deanna had not known until she turned from the rear tires and saw her mother standing and her daughter standing next to her, and Marta was not cheering the way children cheer. She was watching her mother with an expression that was too serious and too old for 12. The expression of a child who has been in the shop enough times to understand what she just saw, who has heard enough of the notebooks read aloud over the workbench to know what 900 revolutions per minute and a flat torque curve means in practice. Deanna raised one hand toward them. Her mother raised one hand back. Marta did not wave. She just kept watching with that serious old expression, and then she turned to her grandmother and said something, and her grandmother nodded. There was a young man from Garrett Foss's crew, 23 years old, who had been the one laughing near the rail before the pull. He came around to where Deanna was standing about 20 minutes after the pull, without his crew jacket, without Foss, and he stood there for a moment before he spoke. "Can I ask you something about the transmission?" he said. "Sure," Deanna said. She spent 11 minutes explaining the Maxitorque compound low selection and the gear ratio math to him, and he listened the way young people listen when they have just seen something that rearranged their understanding of a subject they thought they knew. When she finished, he thanked her, and she said, "You're welcome," and he walked back toward the Kenworth's trailer, and she could see from the way he was walking that he was already thinking about what he was going to do with what she had told him. The final results of the modified diesel class at the 2019 Kankakee County State Pull placed Deanna Kowalczyk and the 1972 Mack R685 first, with a pull of 311 feet. Second place went to a 2014 Peterbilt 389 with a pull of 298 feet. Garrett Foss's Kenworth finished fourth. The R685 is still on the property outside of Buckingham. Deanna drives it occasionally, not to events, just on the property and on the gravel roads nearby, because an engine that is not used is an engine that is not maintained in the way it needs to be maintained, which is to say, through use. The original block is still in it. The 32 notebooks are still on the shelf above the workbench, and there is now a 33rd, which Deanna started in 2016 and continues to add to. Marta is 15 now and has begun reading the older ones, the ones in her great-grandfather's handwriting, which is precise and small and occasionally in Polish, and Deanna has been translating the Polish sections for her on Sunday afternoons in the shop, which is its own kind of long conversation. The hood is still the faded brick color. She has not painted it. She was asked once, at a smaller pull the following spring, why she didn't clean it up a little, put some work into the appearance. She thought about that for a moment before she answered. "If I painted it," she said, "they'd expect it." The clay at Kankakee does not know what something cost. It does not know what year the engine was built, or how many sponsor logos are on the door, or how many crew members are standing next to the trailer. It knows force. It knows what happens when something with enough patience and enough torque and enough understanding of where the power actually lives decides to move. That is the only question the clay ever asks, and the only thing it will accept as an answer. 311 feet, in late August of 2019, on a strip of compacted clay in Kankakee County, Illinois, by a woman in a gray canvas shirt who had read her grandfather's notebooks and understood them, and then improved on them. That happened. It is a fact now. The way the clay made it a fact, and it cannot be unmade. If you know a story like this one, a machine that was written off, a person who was underestimated, a pull or a build or a repair that proved something that needed to be proved, put it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I mean that, because the stories that don't get told at the state level are often the ones that deserve the most telling. Every week on this channel, there's another story about someone who did the quiet work, who understood the thing deeply, who showed up without a sponsor jacket and left with the number on the board. If that is the kind of story you want to keep hearing, subscribe, because there are more of them than you might think, and most of them are sitting on a shelf above a workbench somewhere waiting for someone to read them. And if this story hit you the way it hit the people standing in those grandstands at 271 feet, pass it on. Stories like this one don't survive unless somebody carries them forward. That is all Deanna Kowalczyk was doing with those 32 notebooks. That is all any of us are doing when we tell these stories right.